All right, so let me just start real quick by introducing the team here a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here, and I particularly want to thank the panel members for showing up. General Lundy flew in last night, and General Piggee's been and General Cavoli have been hanging out here yesterday doing other fun stuff, but they all agreed to do this, and I appreciate all you guys saying yes to this. I think this is an important discussion for the Army to have, and I'm not going to say anything more about it other than to say I'm going to turn it over to General Lundy. For those of you who don't know General Lundy, he commands the CAC at Leavenworth, and I've asked him to sort of bring us into sort of his sphere of what he's working on and how it applies to this conversation. And then I'm going to ask the commander of U.S. Army Europe, Christopher Cavoli, to talk a little bit about how he sees this problem set from his perspective inside the COCOM and the Army Service Component Command thereof, and then over to the Army G4, General Piggee, to talk a little bit about it from his perspective. And then I may say a few things here towards the end of this panel, broadcast, but then we really want to take your questions from the floor and have a conversation about the way ahead as we look at 21st century operations and how sustainment's going to play out in this highly contested battle space. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Chip. Appreciate the opportunity. As we look at, kind of where our Army is today, and you heard the Secretary this morning, if you were at the Congressional Staff Breakfast, talk about a renaissance. You heard that yesterday as well. And what's driving that is the operational environment. If you look at, the threats that we face today, they're very different than what we faced over the last 17 years. And the potential for great power conflict is at a level today that, it's probably the highest level it's been since in recent memory. And so with that challenge and the fact that, we've got the potential for, great power conflict, how do we think about changing the culture of our armies? Because, for really the last 17 years, we've been focused on limited contingency operations. When you think about counterinsurgency, stability operations, counterterrorism, and that's something that's going to be prevalent in the future, OE, but that has been our focus. And when you do something for 17 years, that really imprints not only, 17 years of cohorts of leaders, but, it imprints the institutional and generating force as well. Our Army's never done one thing for 17 years. So, one, we've got to think about what that's done to our culture and, what we need to do to potentially adapt to this changing environment that we see and what we expect out in the future from, we're contested in multiple domains. And the NDS this year, as it came out, and the Army was already on this path to change, but we saw the NDS come out this year, and it clearly points us and tells us that the Army was on the right path. 3 to 4 years ago, we shifted how we focused our combat training centers. We focused them back on large-scale combat operations against hybrid threats. So again, trying to lead change, and really our combat training centers lead change in our Army better than anything else. Last year, we released FM30, a new operations manual out of the Combined Arms Center that refocused us on our Army's 4 strategic roles, which is being able to shape security environments, prevent conflict, prevail in large-scale combat operations, and consolidate gains to be able to make the temporary permanent. So we codified our doctrine to be able to drive this change. That doesn't mean we walked away from stability operations. We still have FM307, and within FM30, there's still discussion about how we stabilize, but the focus clearly is on our ability to be able to prevail in large-scale combat against peer threats. That's what enables us as an Army to be able to shape the security environments and prevent conflict. Those all go together. So those 4 strategic roles that we talked about are now codified and moving out on how we think about professional military education. And it's also helping the institution think about what gaps, because for the last 17 years, we optimized our force for the fight that we're in, rightfully so. And you heard the Secretary mention this yesterday. But as we optimized everything in the force for one particular environment, stability operations, limited contingency operations. We let some other areas, we took risk in other areas. And now that we've started to look at that, we always kind of start at the teeth, and we've spent a lot of time looking at the teeth. That's our natural inclination as an Army. And I've really been trying within CAC and all the centers of excellence to look at all those other capabilities that enable the teeth. And that's what the discussion is about today. And we have significant gaps in our enabling capabilities. It's not just in formations, it's not just in capabilities, it's not just in what compo they're in, but it's also kind of cultural, it's training, it's all of those things. So we're going to have to look holistically at a .mil-PF approach, think about the doctrine, and right now the CASCOM is rewriting all of the doctrine for sustainment. as we look at SOCO, they're currently rewriting the doctrine for how we think about civil affairs. So a lot of our doctrine that's in the enabling, now that we have 3.0 to pin it, to underpin that doctrine work is ongoing. We're looking hard at our organizational designs and structures, and we need to look hard at how we train. Right now, I think we've got significant issues in how we train sustainment and all those enabling capabilities to be able to collectively get. So I think there's a lot of good conversations we can have with that today. And so that's our challenge. That's what we're faced with. I think probably what's of most interest, to this session today is what changes need to be made. How do we need to continue to adapt? Because when we think about large-scale combat against a peer threat, that's not something that we've had to train for at scale. And when you think about echelons above brigade, what we're talking about at the theater army level, at a field army level, at the corps, at the division level, that's operating at scale that we haven't done in many, many years. And we're going to start to get back to it as I turn it over to my brother here in Europe. When we think about Defender 2020, that's going to help us to start thinking about that. But in the meantime, all the training and all the leader development that we're doing needs to be focused in that realm. And I think we can have some great conversations about that today. So with that, I'll yield the mic to.
Thanks, Chip. Thanks, Mike. Obviously, what I'm going to say dovetails exactly off of where General Lundy left off, so thanks, Mike. When we think about fighting at scale, we have to reconsider a number of the things that have been our driving principles for the last few years. U.S. Army Europe, of course, is engaged in contemplating large-scale, even continental-wide ground combat, which is something we haven't done very methodically in quite some time. And when we begin to consider that scale of combat, we realize instantly that two things are prerequisite for it. The first is the concept of echelonment, and the second is infrastructure. Echelonment in time, in space, and in organization. And then infrastructure understood very broadly as the system of procedures and physical infrastructure and relationships, the human and physical infrastructure that gives us access, gives us staging, gives us throughput, and gives us mission command capabilities. When we organize these, we are organizing under the current national defense strategy, which has a very useful construct, the contact layer, the blunt layer, and the surge layer. So for us, the contact layer is that layer that allows us to maintain situational awareness, to maintain interactivity that promotes interoperability with our allies or likely partners, which allows us to maintain access to the relevant staging areas and transit areas, and most of all, allows us to compete at the level below armed conflict, which is a significant advance in our national defense strategy this year, and is something that we have to work on every day in U.S. Army Europe, and I dare say in all theaters. The second step is a blunt layer. Should we come to a military confrontation, the blunt layer is that initial burst of reinforcement that adds to the contact layer and gives us the ability to deter or to deny enemy objectives in terms of ground combat. And then the third is, failing that, the surge layer is the flow of what we traditionally think of as the entire tip fiddle, and it goes into fight large-scale decisive combat. Each of those requires a certain amount of theater set. My job, from the perspective of my role as an ASCC commander, is to set that theater. And that theater, I think, in terms of the echelonment that I described earlier, as well as the infrastructure and the organizations necessary to enable the contact layer, to enable rapidly the blunt layer, and then to enable ultimately the surge layer. And I know Chip is going to want to talk a little bit about what's in that surge layer in a couple of minutes. As we look at these layers of the conceptual plan coming together, there are a couple of really key points. The first key point is to find the most economical way to do the contact layer. That is, to have the contact layer. What are those things that must be permanently assigned in the AOR in order to provide the situational awareness, the relationships, the capabilities that are necessary. Then there are some things that must be permanently present, but they might not need to be region-specific. I don't know, the shower detachment or something. That can be rotational heel to toe, and the rest can be flowed in and out as the situation requires. Upon defining those groups, then we can get down to the specific force structure planning. The key in doing that is, though, to make sure that in being economical, in being efficient, we don't become ineffective by placing things outside of the time and space calculation that makes them relevant to the blunt layer or subsequently to the surge layer. So those are the things we work through in U.S. Army Europe every day. There are many tensions that we have to solve as we go about doing, but the biggest tension is to bring the entire mentality, Army-wide, of everybody up to this concept of multiple corps, high echelon, continental scale conflict. Chip?
G4.
All right, well, thank you all. Thank AUSA and to my good friend Chip Luckey for inviting me to be a panel member on this very distinguished panel. You know, we talked about the changing character of war, and it has changed for us in many ways over the past century. Earlier this year, we celebrated 100-year anniversary of the Army G4 and had an opportunity to look back to really see how things have changed in our community from a sustainment perspective, and it has been many. And I think that my friends on the panel, as well as many of you, will agree that logisticians punch routinely above our weight class. We're asked to do a lot. We don't have all the resources. We don't have the force structure. We tend to be male-aligned on tip-fed flows. But at the end of the day, we've been able to be successful, and that's a testament to the great logisticians that make up our formations. We cannot afford to fight the last war better. We must be innovative, create opportunities, and do things differently, I'm convinced, if we want to be successful in the future. I believe that the underpinning of success is a joint force that's lethal in all domains. You know, John Lundy talked about the multi-domain operations of the future. Resilient to sustain operations in contested and sophisticated environments, exactly critical for us. Agile enough to rapidly shift a global posture around the world within a theater, and ready to fight on short or no notice. These are the requirements, I think, that as logisticians we have to be prepared to fight in and sustain our maneuver force. From a logistics perspective, I feel that we must be globally integrated in operations and logistics, prepared to rapidly move within theaters, and our supply chain must match our ability and support our warfighters' requirements. I'd like to go to my slide here and talk briefly, and we talk about a lot of those capabilities on the left side of that slide. Rapid deployment. A lot of you have been working that over the past year. We've kind of been focused on all things specific. We've improved in a lot of different areas and categories, but I will tell you that we have a lot of work to do. We've worked out of FOBs for the past decade and a half, where we would fall in on the FOB, fall in on equipment, primarily have contracted support. I will tell you that fights of the future will come as we are. We'll fight in a disconnected environment, in an expeditionary location, and we have to be prepared to fight from that perspective. Our supply chains must be agile. We cannot depend on that mountain of steel that we're going to push forward. We won't have time to do that, and if we depend upon that, I think we will lose the fight. So in order to do that, on the top side of the right top side, back to basics. Again, we've been fighting this war for 17 years, but our mentality has to change. Now, we're in the process of doing that, the home station training. We've increased the number of our NTC rotations. What I like is that we're seeing our all compos, Compo 2 and in particular Compo 3, sustainment units operating at the National Training Center, at JRTC and other locations. That's how we get better, building those reps and sets, building that muscle memory that I think that we've lost over the past 17 years. Training is what it takes to get after that. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about force structure. Working with General Lundy and CASCOM, we're working to identify those gaps and seams that we've had over the past 17 years. As we transition to a modular formation, I think we forfeited some capability. To operate in this multi-domain environment in the future, we have to be able to fill those gaps and ensure that we have the right structure at the right place to execute and sustain operations and momentum. And at the bottom of that chart is just talking about some of the innovative ideas that we're coming up with. We've talking about reducing demand. And we've talked about that since I've been a lieutenant. And we've done that to a limited degree, but if we're going to be successful in the future, we have to significantly reduce our requirements for fuel, for munitions, for repair parts, where we can make it forward versus waiting on a supply chain that has to push it from Conus. Today, it takes us approximately 3 weeks to fill a high-prior requirement in Poland or Germany to support Joint Cavoli. That's the same time frame it took when I was a captain in Germany some 25 years ago. We have to take advantage of additive manufacturing. That capability exists. We're in the process of finalizing policy and an exhort to get that out where we can train with that capability. You've heard the Chief talk about autonomous resupply. That's a goal. It's realistic. It's happening now in some of our commercial industries, and though, again, we should be prepared to take advantage of that capability that's out there. And then taking advantage of big data. Easier said than done. Taking advantage of today's technology today. I always use the example of my smartphone, my iPhone that I have. You know, when I get an alert of an iOS update, like I did last week, I think with iOS 12, I got a text saying, hey, it's time to update your phone. And it was automatic. It gave me, said, hey, if you plug in the Wi-Fi at midnight, we'll automatically update your phone. And I punched in my code, and the next morning when I woke up, it was up to date. And it takes about 3 minutes. But when we update and provide a skip change for our maintenance support device, which is critical to success in our motor pools, we still have to send a CD-ROM. I'm not kidding. We have to send a CD-ROM. And then we have to make sure, we hope that we have the right mailing address. So we mail it to the unit, and we hope we have the right mailing address. And when it gets to the unit, we hope that the unit provides it to the right clerk. And if it gets to the right clerk, we hope that that clerk prioritizes that upgrade where it's important enough to upgrade the system. But in order to upgrade the system, you have to shut down the system where it can't be used for its intended purpose. And it takes an extended time to execute that skip change. And from the Army perspective, I have no idea if that skip change has been updated. The DAIG was out early this year doing an investigation, and we found that 4% of the Army had the latest skips change on our maintenance support device. But when I fail to update my iPhone, I get a text, a phone call, or an email from my IT folks in the Pentagon and say, hey, you haven't updated your phone yet. When are you going to update your phone? That's taking advantage of today's technology today. So I'm pushing. I need your help to push at that. We're making progress, but there's a lot of work to be done, and I thank you for this opportunity to be part of the panel today. Thank you.
So, Aundre, thanks. And again, teammates, appreciate everybody being here and taking the time to do this. So just a couple of things. I want to, a couple of thoughts, but before I do that, I want to make sure we're all clear. Most of you know this, any soldier in America's Army Reserve knows, I don't come from the sustainment enabler background. You know, it started off as 11 Bravo, and I've been a consumer of goods for a long time. And I suspect that at least 2 of the other 3 panel members up here probably fall into that same category, if not all of us. So I was new to this conversation a couple of years ago, and maybe it's because I was new to it and responsible for this component of the Army that I got seriously interested in figuring out kind of sort of where do we need to go and how do we need to shape this for the future. So I got 4 questions, and I'm going to throw up a couple slides here and talk about it just a little bit, but 4 questions I just encourage you to sort of follow me through on, and then we'll, you know, I'd like to sort of tee off on different variations of a theme on this with the senior leaders up here. So once we get into Q&A, and I would just encourage you to sort of think through with me some of the challenges I see coming. So one of them is, and this is really a conversation with you, sir, is, you know, do we have the right structure in place? And I'll talk about that a little bit. Another one is, do we have the balance inside the Army correct in terms of what do we need to have and which component in order to generate the effects that the Army and the American people and the warfighter expect us to generate? The third one is, what does sustainment operations look like in an extraordinarily contested, disrupted environment? Which, you know, and it goes back to what General Lundy said sort of at the outset. We've been fighting in a certain type of environment for a long time. And frankly, for a lot of the leaders, probably a lot of leaders in this room, it's the only environment that you've ever really trained for or really had to conduct operations in. And I would submit that the next fight may look very different in terms of the level of challenge in doing some of the stuff that we've, I will say, taken for granted for the last 15, 16, 17 years in terms of sustainment operations. And then the last one is, and a couple of the teammates touched on this too, is what's the impact of emerging technologies on this stuff? And from my perspective as the leader of this component, when I think about structure, what things does the Army Reserve need to start thinking about getting out of or getting into in terms of, for lack of a way of putting it, lines of business based on emerging technologies, whether it's leader-follower technology, autonomous, operations and capabilities, particularly in the sustainment domain. And so those are sort of four things that I think about as we talk through some of the challenges that this presents. Just real quick, for those of you who haven't seen this slide before, this is just a real little quick snapshot of RFX. Now, you know, every month I go out to PCC and I talk about this, and General Lundy knows this all too well. I really try to make sure that the total Army understands the challenge packed inside this component of the Army as it sits here right today. This is an unclassified sort of general depiction of what is inside our Ready Force X and what needs to go when in space and time to be able to generate effects to meet a specific timeline, whether it's General Cavoli's timeline for a flow to meet a capability requirement that he has, or more generic requirement for any number of different plans. We've got three types of formations early on in the Army Reserve that we have been, and it's not the totality of RFX, but of the 600 plus or minus units of action inside this configuration, there's a significant number that fall into one of three bins. So unique formations, relatively small number, but those are formations that only exist essentially inside the Army Reserve. 70% or more of the entire capacity of the Army exists only in Compo 3. Of the stress forces, those are forces that the preponderance of which have got to go quickly. So basically 50% of whatever's in the Army Reserve in those particular categories has to move very quickly in space and time to meet requirements. Quickly for us means anything between 3 and 90 days. In sort of orders of magnitude, just so you get a sense of what's packed behind this slide is about 38,000 soldiers. So that's it's a little less than 1/3 of the entire deployable strength on any given day of the Army Reserve. It's packed into a configuration that's got to go within less than 90 days to meet timelines. So that stressed and unique over there on the right, by the way, is where I think we're at significant risk. Because stressed and unique is both. Right. It's those formations that have got to go quickly out of the Army Reserve, a large proportion of them, and nobody, if we can't deliver them, they don't get delivered. Okay, so those are the stressed and unique formation, and you said about 72 units fall into that bin. So anyway, that's just a real, for those who haven't seen it before, that's a real quick sort of tutorial on RFX. Slide. Okay, this is, again, unclassed. This is just a sense of how we see ourselves in terms of current steady state readiness across essentially three different pieces of it. So there's a manning piece to it, of course, which is the foundation. There's a training piece, there's an equipping piece, and then we got to make sure we got the right capabilities in terms of equipment. We're okay there, although we got some work to do in some places. What this does basically is gives you a sense of what sort of mobilization time we would need for certain capabilities. And again, we kept this unclassed, so it's fairly generic, but it gives you a sense. Put this simply, if you look at the 36 to 54 day line up there at the top, so that's 11 units, about 1,200 soldiers, that based on the complexity of the formation, the task, okay, and where they need to be to meet a specific requirement in theater, and the transit time required to get them or their equipment in place, et cetera, et cetera. What it tells me is I got 11 units, about 1,200 soldiers, to meet a timeline, for instance, that General Cavoli has. I'm going to need somewhere between 35 and 50 days of mobilization prior to the initiation of hostilities to meet his requirement in theater. Now, again, this is on class, and this is somewhat, generic in nature. But, and then we walk it back from there. Some formations need less time. They may be less sophisticated. He may not need them quite as quickly. It may be easier to get their stuff done more quickly because it can go strat air as opposed to going by sea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we've worked this down through about 650 different capability sets inside RFX. So I have no problem telling senior leadership, if you want this capability, if General Cavoli needs this capability at C+4, I need some time to get it there. I can't get it there in 4 days. It's going to take us some time. So that is what this slide depicts, and that is what's driving this conversation from my perspective, to make sure I can meet his requirements in space and time to achieve the effects that he needs to achieve. But everybody needs to understand, going back to that stress unique bin, if I can't do it, it's not going to get done in time. And then the question becomes, do we have to rebalance structure? Will I get the time? Will we be able to mobilize these capabilities to generate what General Cavoli needs in space and time? Slide. This is, I didn't make this slide. I don't know where this came from, but all I'll tell you is, as we look at the battle space, and Chris, I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, or Mike, but I just, as we think through our responsibility from a reserve component perspective, from an enabler perspective, really from a sustainment community perspective, I think, I just want to make sure that I got my, I'm tracking with your thoughts on this and Chris's thoughts on this in terms of what do I need to be training my formations to be able to do in this contested space, and what do we think the implications of emerging technology is going to be on how that may, I may have to turn that over the next 5 to 10 years based on sort of where the Secretary's head is on some of this stuff. So that's really it. You can turn the slides off. But that is the reason the reason I asked these three awesome leaders to be up here is I wanted to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer your questions, but also have a dialogue that I think is really important for the Army to have, based on the fact that I know the Army is counting on America's Army Reserve to provide these capabilities in space and time to meet the requirements of the warfighter. And I'm also cognizant of the fact that in some cases, this is not something that's just about money. This is about time, because as everybody who's out there in America's Army Reserve knows, our fundamental challenge is to be ready enough to meet his requirements, that's relevance, but also not so ready that our soldiers can't keep good, meaningful civilian jobs and healthy, sustaining family lives. And so that's our challenge, and we're going to get after it. But that's the end of my opening remarks. And unless you guys want to respond right now to that, I'm going to open the floor.
I just want to say thanks for letting me be on the panel. I learn something every time. Aundre, I have been looking for the slot to put the CD-ROM into my iPhone for years. And I'm so grateful for this.
Thanks, Chris. I'll talk to you after the meeting.
Talk to you later. Help them out later.
I'll offer a thought if nobody's going to,
Oh.
or you're asking.
We got a taker coming up.
Gentlemen, thanks. So as General Piggee had mentioned, in several cases, sustainment units are not really deploying as they train, and the Army remains quite busy. So how do we work through the tension in the time it takes to train for the threat that we've all talked about is the current environment, but also in a way that helps prepare for that, the technology and the innovation that is to come. So in other words, there's a lot of things to train, there's a lot of things to get after, and the Army remains very busy. So how do we strike that balance within our training centers and within our unit training?
I'll take a stab at that one as the proponent for training for the Army. I think my concern in the sustainment community starts not necessarily with training, but organizational design, Log C2, and the whole AA modular concept. That is creating significant problems as we think about how we're going to have to fight in the future. Worked really good for how we were fighting the current fight that we're in. And the other challenge I think that we've got to look at, and this is it is prevalent in the sustainment community, it's in the intel community, and it's in the signal community, is the enterprise approach. That we've taken an enterprise approach, which stability operations, counterinsurgency, fixed base operations, those kind of things allow you to take an enterprise approach. You can leverage other pieces of the enterprise, at the strategic level to be able to compensate for maybe some tactical gaps that you have, tactical capacity issues, and we do a lot of contracting. And those will all play a role in the future, but I would tell you that we've got some significant issues with AA capacity, the company level capacity. And when we look at readiness across the Army, we look at a sustainment brigade, we look at a CSSB, and, you know, the operators who, you know, haven't paid a lot of attention to what happened in Log C2 over the last 10 or 12 years, you know, we harken back to our days, you know, prior to all this, and we think about when you see a CSSB, you think, okay, well, that's like a BSB or an MSB. You know, you don't have an appreciation that, frankly, it's just a headquarters. Right. And the doers are down in the AAs. The AAs sit outside that, so, and they're modular. So I think we've got to, one, change the culture that they will look deeper into the formations, that we need to make them formations again. And I know that modular companies makes it really easy for us to throw things around. But I do think we've got to get back to formation-based. We've done that with the division. We've said the division and the corps, which were just headquarters, modular headquarters, we've made them formations again in our doctrine. You can't have a division unless you have a DORD, a CAB, a sustainment brigade. We've put the sustainment brigades back in the divisions in doctrine. And I think we need to do the same thing within Log C2, and these are discussions we're having with CASCOM. You got to fix that before you can start getting to how you train, I guess is the point. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to get Log C2 fixed and get them back to being formations. Then train them as formations. When we go to the combat training centers, I know at NTC, I've been out there numerous times. We manage the combat training center program for the Army. And as I get out there and I go look at how we're training, you know, we'll have Army Reserve units from all over the place out there, and they're itty-bitty units. And we're not training collectively at home station, and there's not this relationship. And when you think about large-scale combat, to where you're going to be fighting in an environment that, you know, sustainment is going to make the decision on whether we're going to win or fail, frankly. It'll be on the backs of sustainment for us to be able to do this. And when you look at that scale, we've got to train above the company level. And we can't miss the gap. We can't train at the theater sustainment command level. We got to train everything in between collectively. And I think that's where we've got a gap right now. When we think about the sustainment brigade, we put the headquarters in an MCTP rotation. We exercise the headquarters. The CSSB is not getting to work out right now, not as a combined arms team. And the AA companies are kind of piecemealed out. We got to change that whole paradigm is what I would argue. And I think it starts with how we organizationally think about all the sustainment units out there.
Yeah, so Mike, thanks for that. So what I would say is, first of all, I totally agree with you on this. The one thing we are already doing, just so you know, and in fact, Steve Ainsworth and I were just talking about this yesterday, and Paul and I've talked about this as well, is making sure inside, so for the two TSCs, and both commanders are here, that really from a functional perspective are responsible for making sure we got, to your point, the right training going on, and we got some coherence and cohesion being built inside that CSSB thing. What FORCECOM has really helped us do is get essentially a guarantee that at least for the rotations, we're going to go Compo 3 pure, which now gives me, as the commander, gives me the ability to organize that, essentially that CSSB task force prior to executing the mission, to make sure that those teams are training together. And my guidance has been pretty straightforward on this one. I think to the extent that we can do it, I want to get them all out of the same geographic area. So the readiness divisions that got geographic C2 for certain capabilities are supporting that team effort. But I totally agree with you. They can't just meet each other in the box at NTC for the first time.
No, and to Mike's point and to my problem set, which Aundre was referring to a few minutes ago, it's got to go way beyond just getting involved in the CTCs. Right, so the major exercise series in which we actually move organizations from fort to port, from port to port, from port to ISB, from ISB through configuration into tactical assembly areas, and then into a tactical scenario. I think those are really, really critical exercises. As most folks know, we've been doing those for a couple of years at the continental level in Europe. But in 20, the Army has decided, that is the big Army has decided to fund a much larger rotation. It's going to be called Defender 20, and it will involve multiple echelons above brigade and multiple brigades moving in simultaneously to stress the entire home fort all the way to the FLOT deployment sequence and then sustainment sequence. And I think it's going to illustrate an awful lot or illuminate an awful lot of gaps like Mike was talking about. And we're going to have to be able to, scope those very closely with the logistics enterprise to be able to do that. I don't think there's any substitute for operating at scale in order to determine what's necessary at scale. When we go back to some of General Luckey's slides, the doctrine doesn't look too much different than it ever did in terms of battlefield architecture, but the scenarios we contemplate now offer different scales. That JSA, in some cases, can be 750 kilometers deep. And then when we look at the transportation requirements and the POL requirements that generates, and we look on General Luckey's other slide about what are the unique and stressed organizations, that's all the ones that are right there. So we will discover a lot as we go forward with major exercise series, I believe.
If I could, I agree with all of these gentlemen. Log C2, I think we're really struggling and challenged with that. And where I enlist your help to help us identify those gaps and seams, especially in the USAR, where we may not see that. I'm a proponent of its leadership and relationships. And, the former commander of 21st TSC, in Germany, we had limited units there, but I am pleased to see the work that the 21st TSC is doing now with all things Europe. And as Compo 2, Compo 3 units roll in, the relationships that the TSC has with those brigade, battalion, and company level organizations. I look at, in a division today, you have an FSC, and his rating chain is with the maneuver commander. But I will tell you, it's that BSB, our Sustainment Brigade commander, that should be training them how to be a successful company, battalion, and brigade level commander. It's about those relationships and leadership. And it's inconsistent as I travel around the Army looking at division to division and non-divisional units, the nature of that relationship. And I think if we're going to be successful, we got to help our young officers, our young leaders, even though they may not be in our direct chain of command. As senior logisticians, it's our responsibility that we help coach, teach, train, and ensure that they're successful until we get after these Log 2C challenges that General Lundy talked about. We're working with CASCOM to ensure that we are synchronized with the wellhead and advise CAC as they develop this new doctrine, and we get after the force structure that we see short as we look at ourselves now.
Good morning. Can you hear me? I'm Susan Keating with AUSA. And gentlemen, could each of you tell us what keeps you up at night?
I'll make it easy. I'm the oldest general in the Army. Nothing keeps me up at night. But
You're channeling.
yeah, so it's not, I'm just being honest with you. I'm good. But over to the youngsters in the room.
So I'll start from a logistician perspective. I want to make sure that we have the theaters set for any particular fight. We don't have resources to ensure that we can set every theater. When I was the CENTCOM J4, I was concerned about certain commodities that even if we had the commodities, did we have them in the right place? An example is we may have had the correct munition, but if we had the equipment that was going to fire that munition at location X and the munitions at location Y, then I did not consider that a capability that we could depend on. As we look at munitions worldwide now, do we have sufficient munitions to set every pin? Do we have fuel, food, the right uniforms, the right equipment in the right place? Do we have satisfactory pre-positioned stocks? In a lot of cases, we don't have sufficient. So we prioritize. We've paid a lot of attention on the specific for the past year. Now we're looking at Europe. And my concern is, based on the priorities of our nation, do we have the right stocks at the right place to execute combat operations where we can sustain those forces? And we do a very good job, but I'm not confident that we have sufficient if we had to fight on multiple fronts.
I mean, I think for me, as I look at leader development and just the level of intellectual curiosity, of our leaders today to really understand that, hey, what we've been doing for 17 years, there's things that need to change. And I think understanding the environment, studying our doctrine, getting back to, you know, our professional body of knowledge. That's certainly something I've been trying to drive out at CAC. And I think, you know, for us to be able to make this shift of being able to face a very different environment to where, you know, we've had platoons and companies at risk over the last 17 years, but, you know, if we go to great nation conflict, it's our nation's at risk. So that to me is what keeps me up at night is do we have the professional and intellectual curiosity to really drive and study and think about how we develop ourselves and develop the leaders around us and make sure that we have the right professional body of knowledge, become those experts at this new environment. That's probably what keeps me up at night. Go on.
For me, it's the end-to-end robustness of our systems to operate in a contested environment and our ability to make those points of potential failure resilient. So, you know, do we have the ability to move across contested sea lanes in a contested C2 environment, potentially a contested air environment, move all the way to the front contested with contested logistics, as you were mentioning a minute ago, and when it fails, do we have the things necessary to fix it? Like, do we have Class 7 stocks, for instance? So I think that's a pretty big question for the nation, because nothing I just said can be solved without a heck of a lot of money.
So I was just being cute to stall for time for everybody else.
He was
but,
actually snoozing.
Yeah,
and missed
yeah, I
your
was. Yeah,
question.
he woke up.
Pizza,
So
pizza,
actually,
late night pizza,
so I would,
yeah.
so go back to, if you would, hit the slide again where it goes back to, and John Cavoli mentioned it as well. The one that shows you the stress. And okay, so part of what, if something were to keep me up tonight, it would be that right block of things that have to go fast in a significant capacity of the entire United States Army is packed into them, which means Germany's counting on us. The General Cavoli's out there at Freedom's Frontier are counting on us to deliver those things. So I am concerned about our ability to do that within the context fundamentally of a couple things. One, I already talked about the stress between our soldiers managing both their civilian careers, their families, and their responsibilities as soldiers in America's Army Reserve. But the other part of it, frankly, is cultural, and it goes back to something that Mike Lundy touched on again at the beginning, which is we've been doing things for a certain way for a long time. You know, one thing about RFX, it's not a rotational model. It's not a progressive readiness model. It's not designed to build capability over a 4-year period of time and then consume that readiness, disaggregate those capabilities, and start all over again. That, in my view, that is the way, not only have we been conducting operations for a long time because we had, frankly, the ability to do it that way, but it's also become ingrained in our culture to the point where one of the first things we did a couple of years ago when we sort of turned this thing a little bit was talk specifically about RFX in the context of what does it mean in terms of change, cultural change for America's Army Reserve. Because this is about going to high-end, what I would call high-end contingency operations in the most contested environment in the history of civilization, and having to do it as a surge, in our case, 42 to 45,000 soldiers very quickly. We've never done that before. That's it. And our Army's never had to fight that way before, leveraging an operational reserve at that level of effort that quickly to fight an existential war, which is what these guys are talking about. So frankly, part of my concern is I take this responsibility very seriously at a personal level, is making sure I'm doing everything every day in every way to drive cultural change in this component of the Army to make sure we're being able to get after the challenges that this level of effort is going to place on the entire Army, and making sure at least this component of the Army is ready to roll when we got to move. Okay, so that's a change in the way we do business, and candidly, it's a change in the way we see ourselves from a cultural perspective. So I am concerned about that.
Chip, I'd like to point something out. One of the often overlooked aspects of a well-set theater is that the U.S. Army Reserve puts into that theater reserve component element. So I have a reserve command, the 7th MSC. The USRPAC has the 9th MSC. And to General Luckey's points, the current force structure of that reflects our experience of the last 17 years. A lot of civil affairs units and things like that. General Luckey is very generously working with us to make sure that what it really does now, since the situation we're facing has changed, is helps us to set the theater with some of those right-hand boxes up there so that they'll be present in the theater and just require mobilization.
I have a question. General Luckey, I would like to add to what you just stated. With the economy at full employment and technology moving in that direction, and a new generation of people who are thinking different, and an active component that takes the reserve for granted in a sense, how do we penetrate this end strength? Because I don't think, I mean, you're fighting a very tough battle. And, you know, I always would ask, would anybody in the active component leave their job for a year or 6 months and then come back and find out some other individual has moved forward and taken their slot? Unless we get with the corporations and business communities like Lincoln did in, you know, in his union league clubs and what have you, unless we have a full move in that direction, all philosophies, as Clausewitz would say, would be the fog of the war with the people, because I don't think that this generation nor the economy is playing to your game.
So, first of all, I don't feel taken for granted by the Army. So I just want to put that out there first, so nobody thinks that I'm accepting that as a premise. So a couple thoughts. One, as it pertains to end strength, yeah, we are not where I'm supposed to be. We are supposed to be from an end strength authorization perspective. That said, as I mentioned to some of the senior leaders yesterday in the Guard Reserve breakfast, from a deployable perspective, the Army Reserve is a more deployable force than it's ever been. We've cut our non-deployables down by 50% in the last year. So while we haven't met end strength, and we are frankly competing with the other components of the Army for the best talent in America, you know, I'm cautiously optimistic as we take on the mission from at least inside Compo 3 of recognizing every soldier is a recruiter. There's a lot of capacity out there to recruit in a more aggressive fashion inside this component. The other part of it is, I'd say, when you talked about this generation, what's going on in American culture, I'll tell you, we're leaning pretty hard into getting after both not only retaining talent, but actually going out there and assessing talent across America through what I call irregular sessions, primarily focusing on digital technology. So whether it's AI, cyber, quantum computing, going out there and finding the best talent in America. Now, yeah, they still got to meet Army standards. I mean, if you're going to call yourself a soldier, you got to be a soldier. So we're going to work our way through that. But we've actually gotten some relief from the NDAA to open the aperture in cyber for constructive credit for other things. We're getting more aggressive about doing direct commissioning. We're looking hard at do we have the grade plate right for cyber warriors? In my view, sort of, you know, and this is not an Army position. This is just me sort of spitballing. But we've moved force structure to Mountain View, California. It snapped under the 63rd RD out there in Mountain View to go out and capture cyber and AI talent. We've done the same thing in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're going to other places. We may find ourselves in a place where we think for many of these unique specialties and skills, warrant officer grade is an appropriate place to look to find and retain this talent, because what you're really looking for is a high degree of technical efficacy and proficiency. You don't necessarily need to, you know, build a huge, you know, chain of command and expect everybody to sort of operate outside of those technical domains. So we're getting after that. As far as support of the American people, as you know, it's funny you asked the question. We just sat down this morning for congressional breakfast, and I'll tell, you know, I make no bones about it, and we're being recorded here and probably broadcast. I continue to ask senior leaders in the U.S. government, elected leadership, when they ask us, you know, what can I ask them, you know, to do for us? The number one thing I always ask them is go back to your jurisdiction, whether it's a congressional district, whether it's a state, whether, you know, go back and talk to the influencers in your communities across America and make sure that they know that, as far as I'm concerned, if you're partnering with America's Army Reserve share and the best talent in this nation with us, then you're part of the national security fabric of this country. Because, as I said, we cannot do this The Army will not be able to do this unless this component can deliver very quickly those capabilities. And we can't deliver those capabilities if we can't share the best talent in America with private industry, the private sector, and other aspects of the public sector. So I'm not suggesting that you haven't pointed out, a persistent challenge for us. And I'm not suggesting that this is all easy to resolve. But it's our challenge, and we're getting after it, and we're getting after it pretty aggressively. And I'm confident that we're going to be able to deliver in space and time what the American people need us to deliver.
Chip, I would add that I think most active component commanders take their reserve retention mission very, very seriously, and study it very closely. That is, how do you get people who are soldiers who are exiting the active component to re-enlist for Guard or Reserve, and we spend a lot of time thinking of that. I can't talk about, sir, the larger demographic challenges you discussed, but I can tell you in terms of taking things for granted, U.S. Army Europe relies greatly on both Compo 2 and Compo 3. There are the requirements of the contact layer, as I described it earlier, turn out to be more dynamic than one would expect. And frequently, the demands are more dynamic than the active component has the elasticity to fulfill. And I can turn to General Luckey, I can turn to General Cavoli, and very, very quickly through the DCGs that they have given me, Deputy Commanding Generals for Guard and Reserve Affairs, am able to fill genuine requirements to compete below the level of armed conflict, usually, frequently, only with Compo 2 and Compo 3, so we appreciate it very much.
Cool. So, go ahead, Mike.
I'll just offer one thought. As we think about what's been going on the last 17 years, the total Army has shouldered the load together. And I think whether you're AC, Compo 2, Compo 3, we've all viewed it as, hey, we're shouldering the load. I think what's becoming even more apparent now is because we have so much capability, and I'll talk specific to Compo 3 because that's our discussion here, we can't actually win the next fight, okay? We could endure and do what we've been doing for the last 17 years, potentially, if we didn't want to distribute the load, and it's good that we were distributing the load. But as you look at this next fight, we actually need the total Army. And any piece of that that's missing, we lose. So, I would tell you, I don't think any of the senior leaders today or anybody out there who's been studying our problem set will take Compo 2, Compo 3 for granted. And I think we've got to look very hard at, and I think that's a part of this whole readiness piece and how we think about what structure needs to be where as we go to the future, how we're going to fight together to be able to win that next fight.
Total Army is absolutely how we must fight in the future. From a sustainment perspective, we fought that way in the past, absolutely critical. I don't know how you calculate what the metric is, but about, give or take, 78% of sustainment is in the reserve component. We can't get there. We talked about the balance. Do we have that right? We need to have that discussion to ensure that we have the right mix and balance of forces, specifically if we can execute those early entry requirements. But I will tell you, over the last 17 years, 78% of those forces sustaining operations in Iraq and Afghanistan come from this component. Certainly for me, I've never taken that for granted. And in order to be successful, it's the total Army requirement.
And it's not just sustainment. It's a significant amount of our mobility and counter-mobility assets. It's the bulk of our civil affairs, the bulk of our psychological operation, almost all of our information operations related capability. I mean, that's all in this compo, and it's all absolutely critical, not only how we compete, but also how we prevail.
We can't do a major wet gap crossing in Europe right now without
No.
without CHIPS forces. We've got National Guard forces fulfilling our NATO responsibilities in northeastern Poland with the enhanced forward presence right now. John, raise your hand, please. Major General John Gronsky is a generous contribution from the Army National Guard to U.S. Army Europe for the last 2 years, where he manages those programs for us. All of that is absolutely important when you get to combat support and combat service support, but it's also the combat forces that we have to keep. We can't go into too much detail, but as you pointed out, the entire force flow. It's not too far into the force flow before you start hitting things other than Compo 1 and Compo 1.
Lieutenant Colonel Stanwich, Nick Army Reserve. This may be a question without an answer. Listening to General Piggee talk, the tyranny of time and distance hasn't changed in years, and it still takes 30 days to get a piece of equipment from point A, CONUS, to point B, any theater overseas. Yet our doctrine has moved to the point that with multi-domain battle, where we're trying to make decisions in nanoseconds to take advantage of windows of opportunities to destroy the enemy. Have we created a gap between our tactical doctrine and our logistic capabilities that we're not going to be able to fill?
Well, I would tell you that what we need to do is be able to get our sustainment capabilities and doctrine up to where it can enable operations, you know. And that's what we're working towards right now while we're relooking our current sustainment doctrine, while we're relooking certain kinds of capabilities. Your point about, you know, time and distance, I mean, physics, we haven't figured out how to bend physics yet, so I'm still working on that out there. I've actually got about 12 or 13 people that are focused on that, so, just kidding. Because the secretary come in and go, I want all 12 of those. You gotta,
That's right. Take 'em away.
that'll be the first reform initiative I'll hear about.
In fact, I've got that down.
Yeah, Roger, I'm sure
I need 11 of them.
you'll square me away. You know, but certainly, you know, as we think about, you know, the physics of the problem, there are ways to work around those physics. I mean, as we look at prepositioned stocks and equipment, we talked about what we have in the contact layer. You know, do you have the right capabilities there that can buy you the time to allow you to surge, to get to the surge, or to get to the blunt in the surge? So I think those are all a part, you know, all parts of that. When you think, you know, from a, you know, being able to exploit windows of opportunity, absolutely. That's when we're talking about the battle is joined at that point in time. But there's also during competition, are we able to, you know, from a cognitive perspective, a temporal perspective, there's a lot of things when we think about how we maintain positions of advantage that don't necessarily require, you know, the physical movement of forces. And there are forces that we do have in place that allow us to do that. So how we think through, and I think that's, you know, some of the challenges General Cavoli's got to work and all the theater Army commanders of, you know, how do you look at your problem set? How do you tailor the theater unique to the threats and the adversaries? And that's where our future conceptual work, and that's where some of our doctrine's going from a theater Army perspective, is to tailor them for their problem. The problem in Europe is different than the problem in multiple parts of the Pacific. You depends on where you are in the Pacific, what USAPAC's problem set is versus what our South faces. So
A lot of your question goes to posture, right, as General Lundy was mentioning. Because the easiest way to solve the time-distance problem is with posture. So I spend an awful lot of time, my personal energy, thinking through that question. There are a couple of reasons. The first is because there is a tension between the institution of the Army's requirement to be ready to respond globally versus the timeliness of that response in a particular place. That's just a hard thing to balance because it can't, if we're lucky, it operates the same, but most of the time you can't anticipate that. Likewise, inside the theater, I have a microcosm of the same problem. The only thing worse than having everything positioned at exactly the right place for a timely response to a fight is discovering that that's not where the fight's gonna be, right? So it's the question between overcommitment and under-responsiveness. And that's just something we have to balance every day. Pre-positioned stocks and things like that help a lot, but actually achieving operational agility, let alone strategic agility in the ground fight, is something that is going to occupy a lot of our intellectual capital for the next dozen years, I would say.
and it gets much harder with a smaller Army. I mean, that's, you know, you can hedge your bets when we were, you know, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. It's pretty easy to hedge your bets with capability. You know, it's a little more difficult today. So again, that's why we've got to be students of what's going on and really looking hard and thinking deeply about how do we solve these problems and not think that we're going to get to a solution on, you know, it's going to be enduring. It's going to be constantly changing. So we got to be able to evolve and look at it. And I think that's why, you know, what General Cavoli and his team does compared to, you know, with all the other theater armies, that's in the contact layer. That's who's persistently out there looking and sensing, and that's where we've got to constantly be able to adapt from. That's the purpose and why, you know, they're so important to our Army.
So I'm glad you asked that question so I can kind of clarify my comments earlier. We're not standing pat, accepting the status quo. We're making changes. We're being innovative. And General Cavoli talked about this. Army pre-positioned stocks, we're building that out in Europe now to facilitate rapid execution of potential operations. We're stocking. I talked about what keeps me up at night is setting the theater. However, Europe is a priority, and we're doing certain things to ensure that he has the capability he needs to rapidly expand at a given time. So we're not standing pat. We're doing a lot of things. We have executed common ASLs that and I'm sure you're familiar with. We've seen that our supply availability rate continue to increase and improve. We've seen readiness across the Army improving over time. So we acknowledge what our challenges are. We're not where we want to be, but we have an end game and a goal, and we're being innovative to try to create opportunities and taking advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves. And we continue to see readiness increase over time. The Secretary-in-Chief talked about this morning. First thing the Secretary said, there's top 3 priorities: readiness, modernization, and reform. Readiness is central to everything that I'm responsible for on a day in and day out basis. And we continue to see the number of BCTs readiness rates increase, all compos. We're really getting after those itty-bitty units that make up the reserve component. They are actually, we talked a bit about the training, both home station and NTC, and we're utilizing them more and more every day. So I think our increasing readiness is improving across all compos. There's work to be done, but that's not to say that we're not getting after it, and we see marked improvements every day.
Yeah, I'd just say, I think, I touched on it, I think, in my opening comments, and General Cavoli just touched on it again. So posture, I think part of the reform conversation is, I think, goes to, do we have the right structure in the right place in terms of capabilities across the 3 components of the Army? But the other part of it goes back to what General Cavoli just touched on again, which is, do we have the right stuff forward positioned from an Army Reserve perspective? Because the one advantage, frankly, that we have in the Army Reserve is, and it takes a while for us to shift. So to General Lundy's point, we can't turn on a dime. So we have some flexibility, but it takes us time to, in some cases, reclassify soldiers for a different MOS based on the fact that we've changed force structure someplace where they live, because we don't PCS them anywhere, as you well know. We go and re-recruit and retain our soldiers where they live and work. So for those soldiers who are going to live and work predominantly in Europe, one of the things that General Cavoli and I have talked about multiple times, and working very closely together, is, making sure I'm supporting him as he has to shift his thoughts on what he needs first to make sure over time. And I talked to, I don't know if we have TRADOC reps in the room, but I've talked to TRADOC about making sure we lead turning. I know, but I'm talking about the school street thing. But yeah, if you want to take it on, okay, all right. I got to do out for you.
Roger.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So because we need to lead turnus. If we're going to take a structure that's been there for 15 years in terms of one capability and turn it into something else, then I need to make sure I'm sending a signal back to the schoolhouse. So we need to reclass some folks. And I didn't know that General Lundy was going to take that on, but now that he is, that's awesome. But at the end of the day, the one advantage we have, frankly, is I can move structure. We can shift structure to support General Cavoli, and nobody leaves, Georgia. Nobody leaves Florida. So from a standpoint of sort of blowback because we're moving a formation to some other place out of a district, we're not. We're not moving anybody anywhere. We're just moving a requirement to some other place where his soldiers already live and work, and now we're optimizing that workforce for him for 21st century combat.
So that restructure will significantly help in the timeliness of delivery of capabilities in one of the tip fiddles we've got. And those capabilities in the main will be things that hit General Piggee's world favorably. So it's very, very useful to do that. One of the reasons it's so important for speed to go faster, though, is the contact layer is in contact. So it is not as though operating this way is 100% without risk. Where's Dragoon 6 back there? 2nd CR, raise your hand, Colonel. So there's the leadership of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment right there. Hey, Sergeant Major, how you doing? It's this is an organization that works for U.S. Army Europe, right there all the time, operating back and forth, frequently fulfills our EFP role and everything. If something were to start I would require an awful lot of reinforcement for those gentlemen right there. And so it's not an inconsequential or a theoretical discussion that we're happening. The ability of the contact layer to be reinforced by a blunt layer and then to move into a surge layer is absolutely critical. So every little way we can figure out to overcome time-space problems with clever posture methods and things like that is critical. One of the things that's going on is when General Piggee talks about the pre-positioned stocks, you know, there's a question, at what level of readiness is that pre-positioned piece of equipment held? And the Army's making very significant investments to hold that at something, something higher than a warm status.
Cool.
So it's like old home week looking at the front table there, having served with brigade commanders with a variety of those 3 stars. They've obviously done better than me. Back in the Cold War days, we had the pre-positioned stocks, we had the Pomkas, we're kind of going back to that. One of the other force multipliers we had back in those days was interoperability. We looked at the fact we had a developed theater, and we looked at our NATO allies and said they've got a lot of logistics capabilities on the ground. If we've got the right adapters, if we understand the same, we have the same STANAGs, standard NATO agreements, et cetera, we've kind of wandered away from that, and I'd look for the theater commander as well as the G4 to talk us through how we might be swinging back that direction and leverage the capability of our allies. Thank you, gentlemen.
Aundre, if I could start, Rich, good to see you. The key to that is to interoperate frequently, which is one of the reasons I mentioned that interoperability is one of the outputs of having a good contact layer in place. So by conducting exercises frequently, we can identify where we've fallen away from STANAGs, where a STANAG has become outdated, or where a STANAG is inadequate designed or is required to be updated. And then we work with the Department of the Army and with our allies to try to overcome those things. So there is a way we go about doing this. There's a way we codify it and everything. Whether or not all nations always make those investments is a different question.
Yeah, as you know, logistics is a national responsibility. However, it's important that we have those discussions that we can support one another. You know, I have an opportunity to participate and counterpart visits with the Chief of Staff when his various countries come and visit. And we always have that discussion, this discussion about logistics, how we can ensure that we are interoperable with one another and support with one another. And we try and identify those relationships and identify with each company, each country, what they can bring to the fight, what their specialty is. And we develop those plans and test that over time. So I think there's, with Europe more so than other areas, I think we have some opportunity to be a bit more aggressive, but we are having that dialogue. We've identified some areas that we will support them, we've agreed, and we can expect their support. So it's a work in progress, but there are discussions, and we have plans in place to do exactly what you described.
Gentlemen, when I listen to the requirements that are being laid out, what I'm hearing is almost a requirement for almost 2 different armies, and not dissimilar to what I saw in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where you have the force focused on Europe or Korea. They train together, they have habitual relationships together, they're equipped alike, and then the force that is focused on other things. We almost headed back to that based on the time, training requirements, equipment requirements, and that required for a great nation fight. Back then, it almost seemed a difference between light and heavy. Is there even though soldiers went between the two, the units seem to have different focus. Are we almost headed back to that time of period?
Well, I mean, I don't think we have the luxury of having 2 armies. You know, I mean, that's we got 1 army. It has 3 components. And just based on size and everything. So the chief's been pretty clear on where he wants us to focus from a readiness perspective, that you train against the most dangerous threat, where the nation may be at risk, and that's, you know, against a peer or near peer threat, great power conflict. and then you adapt to the other missions that you have. You know, whether we put a National Guard or an Army Reserve or an active component unit to deal with the hurricane relief, or whether they're going into Afghanistan, you know, our soldiers are well led, well trained, and if they focus on, you know, the high-end fight, we certainly can adapt to pretty much anywhere along the conflict continuum within the range of military operations. And for those that are in fact deploying to, and on the patch chart to go to, you know, a different kind of fight, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, you know, there's a period in their training time where they build up to that, and we do those MRXs and other stuff. So I mean, I think the bottom line is we've got to train for the most difficult fight, and then be ready for that, and then adapt to the environment, because the Army, you know, the total Army, the Joint Force is not big enough to have a lot of niche capabilities. Now, I do think we do have niche capabilities. As we look at Security Force Assistance Brigades, you know, those are certainly helping in a niche area. And we've got to get back to where we don't optimize everything for, I mean, the reason we have civil affairs units, the reason we have psychological operations units, the reason we have, you know, information operations brigades, some of those capabilities, we've got to bring them back to the forefront of being the specialists in some aspects of the conflict continuum versus other units. And I think what we did was we kind of optimized every unit for one piece of the fight. And now what we need to do is have different kinds of units that have different capabilities, and they're more optimized in one piece of the spectrum in the continuum than other ones. That's how we have a much more balanced Army that's capable of operating throughout that continuum. So, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
So I get it. So just let me just sort of roll in on top of that, because I agree with John Lundy completely. The other thing I'd say is, from a training perspective, at least inside the Army Reserve, and Mike, this is something probably that you know, you and I should probably talk more about in a different forum. But one of the things I've looked at a little bit and encouraging the team to look at is, you know, which of our inside the Army Reserve, which platforms are optimized for certain types of training. You know, because as you well know, I go out to different platforms and everybody tells me we can do this, we can support this, we can support that. But the reality is, I've got some real estate that can support maneuver, and I got some real estate that really can't support much. It may be able to support a lot of stuff at the low end, in terms of whether it's, you know, supporting the SFAB training and other stuff like that, but it's not going to support significant maneuver training. So we're looking inside our component to make sure we're optimizing our real estate to best get after those things. But the other part of this is, of course, across the total force, and you and I have talked about this many times, making sure that, you know, I'm a full-up participant and making sure I'm supporting your efforts to train the total force in time and space, by making sure we're doing everything we can to get the right formations, in whether it's at JRTC or some other platform, make sure we get the right enablers in there, get the right maneuver enhancement capabilities in there, so we're training as a total team across a full spectrum of conflict. So I actually think we're trying to get after this pretty aggressively.
Good morning, gentlemen. My Brigadier General Johnson, USFK, CFC C9. My question is regarding readiness of the unique and stress units. In Korea, we have a rotational BCT that comes on pin to continue to train and maintain readiness and set the theater and be ready to fight tonight. What are your thoughts on these unique and stress units that came up on your pad chart, actually deploying and training pre-crisis for these supported commands? And it may be an authority issue, funding issue, but I was looking at, back to your thoughts.
So from my perspective, so two things on these. First of all, RFX is so of those, and I can't remember what the exact number was up there, 72, I think. Of those 72 UICs that have got to go very quickly, yeah, believe it or not, 72 plus or minus. How about that? So of those capabilities, it's going to take us more than 72 units to generate that. So we got to build the P to get the T to get to the C to get that unit fully mission capable. So that, as I said, takes time. It also takes something we call aggregation, which means we're going to go to other places in other formations inside that same SRC to draw either down echelon formations, goes back sort of to what General Lundy was talking about earlier about the CSSBs, or in some cases individual soldiers that need to fill out those formations. Now we're going to flip that switch in 24 hours, and that unit that may be yellow today is going to go to green tonight, because we're going to make sure that we've got the right people in the right places to generate that capability. And then the key is to train that formation prior, to your point, train that formation prior to actually having to deploy into combat or to go through a last check at a mobilization platform before it goes off. As far as our willingness to support that, absolutely. the key becomes not just authorities, all right, but making sure that those formations that are out there getting after the building readiness, okay, building readiness when they do these things. So from an objective T perspective, from making sure we're getting the reps and sets, making sure we're meeting the METs, making sure we're getting the live fire that we need, et cetera, to meet Army readiness requirements. From a deployable perspective, that we are building readiness when we exercise those formations. And candidly, in many cases, this component of the Army has said yes to a lot of folks who wanted help, but the help that we were giving them, the help that the things we were doing to support, weren't necessarily building readiness into the Army Reserve. They may have been helping somebody else do something they wanted to do, but it wasn't necessarily building readiness for this team. And job one for America's Army Reserve is to develop and generate these capabilities in space and time to support the warfighter. So that's my fundamental responsibility. We'll partner with anybody along the way, but at the end of the day, that's what we're going to do.
I just have one thing to add to that, General. Yes, I absolutely advocate exercising those capabilities. Many of them can only be exercised in a relevant way when you're exercising at large scale. And the last thing I'd say is, unlike in the Pacific, in Europe, the European Deterrence Initiative funding source has allowed us to use OMA to source some of the ADOS requirements, and that's given us a great deal of flexibility, for which we are very grateful if there are any people from the U.S. Congress here. Seriously, it's been a total game changer because it allows us to employ the Compo 2 and Compo 3 forces in the flexible way that I've been describing. It not only helps us compete, but it helps us exercise those key stress things.
Major Reed Johnson from OCAR. Has there been any serious consideration regarding the educational platforms to understand the true role of sustainers as well as all multi-compos so that everyone truly understands every role and also the true role of the sustainer in mission success?
So you're talking about professional military education?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, before you do this, this is from basic and BOLIC all the way to the Sergeant Major
Yeah.
Academy and War College.
okay, I can cover all that. Oh. It's all in the
You got it all.
CAC. It's
You
all
got
in
it
the
all.
CAC portfolio. So
Did I tell
we
you
got
this
it
is the
cradle to
trade-off?
grave.
Did I tell you this is the trade-off rep in the room?
So, yes, first and foremost, it's not we're changing PME to figure out, to have a greater appreciation of sustainers. We're changing PME to focus on the problem that we have today, which is facing large-scale combat. Now, I would tell, I'd ask all of you, if you look at this month's Mill Review, and that way I can be shorter on my answer, I've written an article in Mill Review. It's the one with the big explosion on the front of it, on large-scale combat. And it talks a lot about these things we're changing in PME and other stuff. But the bottom line is, we are getting after changing our PME to refocus on the problem set that we have to solve today. And that is to gain a greater appreciation for combined arms operations, of which sustainment is a huge part of that, and at scale. But it's also how do we better understand intel differently. We've been very joint over the last 17 years, but we've been joint down at the small unit level. And we've had to be less joint up at the larger unit level because just the complexity wasn't there to have to drive that. So we're seeing that in our Mission Command training program, how we get after better jointness. But yes, across all of professional military education, there's a refocus on how we deal with peer threats, near-peer threats, and large-scale combat. And I think that will drive, how we look at sustainment differently. In the Commander General Staff College, for instance, there's multiple battle periods now that are focused on that as opposed to where we were on stability operations, which basically most of the solutions were contract solutions. And the future of large-scale combat is not contracting command, although they will have a very key role in it. Our sustainers are going to have to be those tactical sustainers that we've always expected them to be out there on the battlefield. And then we will have to figure out the difference between service station and, tailgate. That'll come back into our lexicon. And there's no laughing, so obviously you guys haven't been reading your doctrine. But, no, I'm just kidding.
Why is it always a test with you?
Yeah, I know. But anyway, I think the answer is yes. How's that? Oh,
And I can just say, I think from a sustainment community, Mike is the expert, but we're seeing that that additional focus at the schoolhouse, specifically for the sustainment community. So, I appreciate that and applaud that. So I think we are headed in the right direction.
Gentlemen, thanks for being here and doing the panel. Chris Stockel, commander of the 351 Civil Affairs Command out in California, supporting Indo-PACOM and also Korea, and formerly the part-time C9 for General Brooks there. The question has to do with completely on board with readiness. That's pretty good for my job security. Understand lethality, but when it comes to influence, and I just want to speak from the civil affairs side and the prevent side. So we build a yearly training calendar, even 2 years, platform weaponry. We're doing all of that. We're building readiness in our exercise support, but the prevent and the shape, especially given the preponderance of civil affairs, psychological operations, information operations, how are the ASCCs supporting the influence and the prevention with the hope of not going to phase 3? Thanks.
Essentially, everything we do day to day with the contact layer, with the present forces, is intended to produce the effects you just described, right? To reduce the likelihood of conflict, and then to make sure that we're prepared and have mostly the access and the transit necessary to fight, as well as the situational awareness. So how do we do that? We do that mainly by operating in the AOR within our functions, right? A cavalry unit spends its time doing exercises in the relevant parts of Europe. We carefully codify the things that we learn out there. We have reams of data on routes and things like that. Our aviation units are constantly probing the regulation and things like that, and airspace management processes across Europe. So a lot of those things directly with regard to civil affairs or influence operations. Obviously, we do those as part of U.S. EUCOM, and there's a very concerted COCOM-wide effort to put our messages out and to counter what we consider to be malign messages. And our main methodology in that regard is to attribute and to produce the truth, because I don't need anybody's authority to do that. We can do that immediately. And we have very effective Tiger teams, part contract, part uniform, part DA civilian, that work with EUCOM, and EUCOM has them articulated throughout the AOR. And when they see malign information coming out, we immediately work to turn it around, produce the truth, and attribute the falsehood. In that regard, we work very, very closely with our allies. A great example, a German commander of the multinational battle group in Lithuania a few months ago was suddenly faced a flood of stories that were untrue completely about his opinions about Lithuanians and things like that, just tried to cast an aspersion over them. We very quickly recognized the falsehoods. Germany did also. We very quickly found some attribution for it, and with Lithuania and using Lithuanian media, we turned around and the Lithuanians countered the story on behalf of the alliance and on behalf of their ally, Germany. It was a very effective way to put the story to bed very, very quickly. I hope that answered your question a little bit. This is the guy who thinks about that every day, though, right here.
I couldn't answer it any better. No, I think it was good. You know.
Any more? Okay, you guys anything else you want to say?
General, one other quick question. I work for you, General Luckey. I'm one of your ambassadors from Illinois. But I was a former mayor, and I had several people who worked for me, PD, fire, that were in the reserve and guard. And I didn't have any issues. I knew what kind of toll they would take, and some of my counsel were upset when they were deployed for a year or 2 years or whatever it may be, but in general, there was not an issue. However, yesterday I was at a breakout session with the CSMs, and again, I announced, I'm here trying to help, give me your input. And some of them came up afterwards and were concerned that even though there should not be an issue from the employer in terms of when they return to their job and things of that nature, that there may be, whether it be subtle or not. Do you feel that there's sufficient legislation that protects our guardsmen and reservists Or is there something that needs to be more codified in law that says, as a protected class, that's not even something you ask about, whatever their commitments are there commitments?
So you're asking me?
Yeah,
Okay. And you said you're working for me?
so
Okay.
far, unless
Yeah,
I've said something I'm
No,
not
just
supposed to.
because my battle buddy here looked, he's
No, I said he's yours.
Yeah.
Luckey,
So,
Lundy,
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
sounds the same.
yeah.
He's the oldest general, so I help.
Yeah, that's right.
You know.
He's the trade oct rep in the room. Hey, look, so here's my view of this, all right? And I get asked this a lot, so I got this one. Hey, look, first of all, managing relationships is, in many cases, one soldier at a time and one chain of command at a time, okay? So this is fundamentally about leadership at echelon. And I get asked this question a lot, and I talk to a lot of soldiers all across the battle space, 200,000 across 20 time zones. And one of the things I find over and over and over again is the chain of command is not engaged. In fact, I was just talking to one of our leaders here this morning, Bob Harder's in the room, but Bob and I were just having this conversation an hour ago. Over and over and over again, I see soldiers that are being told for whatever reason by their chain of command that they've got to be at this battle assembly or else. And even though it's a significant work conflict, or in many cases, they're going to miss a chemistry final in their second year of college because they're in college, and they're going to have to take the semester over again because the chain of command is not being responsive to making sure we're working with our soldiers. And then I find out that two members of the chain of command are standing in the same tent at the same point in time, and they never had this conversation until I show up. Are you kidding me? So part of this is about, thank you. So part of this is about making sure that we are at echelon through leadership, engaging and making sure we're doing everything we can to mitigate the impacts of these stress points on our soldiers, what has to do with relationships with their families or relationships with their employers. And in many cases, what I expect, and what in many cases what we've seen works, is for the chain of command to engage employers to make sure we're helping those soldiers manage those relationships. Now, as to your specific question as it pertains to relief legislatively, let me just tell you this. As a leader of this organization, I'm very concerned about getting us to a place where our soldiers are so legally protected, okay, or the class, to your point, is legally protected, that nobody wants to hire any soldier who's in the Guard or Reserve, because the bottom line is they're taking a significant economic risk to their bottom line of their business if they're expected to hire soldiers that essentially are now insulated from their responsibilities to that employer. So my responsibility is to help them manage that relationship as best we can. Remember what I said when we started, okay? And since you're an ambassador, I expect you to go out there and propagate this message. Our challenge is we got to be ready enough to be relevant, but we can't be so ready that our soldiers can't manage these relationships with their families and their employers. So I appreciate your support. Get out there and keep pounding.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. So far, well, but I don't know. You may ask another question, so don't commit. Chris, you got anything you want to add?
Absolutely not. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
No, great
G4?
session. Thank you, sir.
All right, so yeah, so Ambassador, you still got a job. You're good, okay. Because we're not taking more questions. Hey, look, I appreciate everybody being here. I really appreciate this team supporting this conversation. What I would tell everybody in this room, and we've had this conversation offline, all of us, this conversation doesn't end here. This is an ongoing conversation inside the Army, and this is an ongoing collaboration between, in this case, America's Army Reserve and the commander of U.S. Army Europe to make sure that we're doing everything we can do to support the Army service components and the other COCOMs and getting this right, and that we're also supporting the Army's requirements from a sustainment community perspective and from other perspectives to make sure we get the structural balance of the Army rise and move into the future. Because if we don't have the time we need to get ourselves absolutely ready to go into what arguably, as the chief says, probably the largest, I'll just say, challenge in the history of warfare, then we're not doing our job. So we're here to do that. So anyway, appreciate everybody being here. Thanks. Have a great meeting.